You've landed inside Launch Street, the Business Innovation Podcast, where we interview top innovators out there shaking things up so you can innovate, differentiate, and get further faster. Since you're here, we know you're the type of person that recognizes the importance of unlocking your innovation advantage so you can compete and win. And now, your host, the person that has worked with leading companies like Disney, Procter & Gamble, Aero Electronics, the U.S. Army Research Labs, and Red Robin on upping their innovation advantage. Tamara Gontor.
Welcome to Launch Street, my friends. I have a treat for you today, both in terms of the interview and a gift. I know, since you're listening to this podcast, that you're the type of person that is a leader and an innovator, and I want to reward you for that. I want you to have the biggest innovation arsenal in your back pocket, available 24/7, so that you can make the biggest impact possible and be recognized as the go-to innovator that you and I both know you are. So here's what I want you to do. Click on the link in the show notes, and it will take you to our innovation toolkit. It's online. Type in Innovators Rock, INNOVATORS Innovators Rock. Put that in the promo code and see how easy I am making it for you to ignite innovation daily. Bam! Okay, now to the interview. This one is going to surprise you. Today, to talk innovation, I am going to the U.S. Army. That's right, the military, a place you don't expect to find innovation. But it turns out at the Army Research Labs, innovation is infused into the DNA of the entire organization. Today's guest, Dr. Perconti, is the director of ARL, as it's called for short. This is a team of researchers, generals, administrators, operators that work to keep our soldiers safe and give them the competitive advantage on the field. Talk about pressure to perform. We dig into driving innovation across your entire organization, how to create a sense of urgency that ignites action, and why and how collaboration wins. So I've actually worked for and with the ARL for several years now, and each time I walk away, I am more impressed than the last. I think you will be too. So let's get to it.
Dr. Perconti, thank you so much for joining me today. It's so good to connect with you again, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to talk to you. It's always fun to be able to share some ideas about innovation and about what's happening at the Army Research Laboratory and what our future holds for us. So it's always good to chat with you, and I'm happy to do it.
So since our first time as listeners getting to know you, what's the one thing people would be surprised to learn about you?
Let's see. What is the one thing people would be surprised to learn about me? So I've been doing this research and working with the United States military for 39 years now.
Wow.
And what most people are surprised to know about me is that I started as an enlisted sailor right out of high school, enlisted in the Navy. And I spent 6 years in the Navy, 5 of which floating around the Western Pacific on a destroyer. That's kind of how I got my start with the U.S. military. Most people look at my background and sort of my career, and they go, "Wow, we didn't realize you started at 18 doing work for the military." So that's always a surprise. But to me, of course, that's really what got me started, got me invested in science and engineering, and I'm always very thankful to the Navy for giving me a little bit of discipline. I didn't have it when I was 18, that's for sure.
So I have to ask, is that why you enlisted? Because I've talked to some other people, and they often tell me that they knew they needed discipline and structure among wanting to see the world, and that's why they joined.
Yeah, my story. So I was going to play football. I grew up in New York City in Brooklyn, and we were city champs one year, so we thought we were pretty good. But scholastically, we were just not into it back in the day, I would say. But I was going to play football coming out of high school, and I got a call from the coach at the school I was going to go to, because I had already sent in my application and what courses I was going to take. And he called me up and he said, "Look, you can't take these courses." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you want to take math and science classes." And I said, "So what's wrong with that?" And he said, "Well, football players don't take math and science classes. They have to take, physical education and everything else." So that it really turned me off to going to school. And then I had two friends of mine who one summer said, "Hey, we're going to go talk to the Navy recruiter." 2 weeks later, I was in boot camp. And my other two friends didn't join. But I did. So that's it was kind of it. It was kind of spur of the moment. I called my mother up and I said, "Mom, I enlisted in the Navy." She said, "Come home, let's talk about it." I said, "Mom, you don't understand.
It's done." Turns out there's no turning back. It's done.
No turning back.
Oh my God, I love it. Well, I did not know that about you, and that is definitely gives great context, I think, to our whole conversation, just giving your, I think, long view of kind of, the military and kind of what you're doing now. So let's talk a little bit about that. So you are, tell me if I got this wrong, but director of the CCDC ARL.
That's right. And, Combat Capabilities Development Command, Army Research Laboratory.
Got it. And we can refer to it as ARL from here on out.
Absolutely.
So people know what we're talking about. Awesome.
Right.
And we've talked about this on the side, but I'd love to hear what your vision is for ARL and what you're looking to accomplish.
Yeah, sure. So ARL is the Army's corporate research laboratory. So we're responsible for all of the what we call foundational research, the basic and early applied research that has to do with the United States Army and its mission. And really, the vision for the laboratory is to take care of what the Army needs and what our soldiers need from a technology perspective. For the longer term, what happens to war fighting, to soldiers, to the rest of our partners and allies beyond the year 2035, let's say. And are we prepared as a nation, and are we prepared as an army to face whatever adversary may come our way, God forbid, to deter at all cost, and if necessary, to fight and win. So that's really our mission and the reason why we exist as a laboratory.
So I have to imagine with that as your vision and really constantly having to stay ahead of the game, for lack of a better way to say it, that innovation becomes a really important part of your mission and how you operate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you have to, have a good sense of what has been done historically in these sort of traditional research laboratories and institutions, the way people have done research in the academic environment, the way research is done in small and large businesses, and given that sense, have an understanding of how you have to innovate and change really the way you do business to affect their capability for the 21st century. And so innovation plays a big part of that. It's much more about changing the way people think and changing the way the culture of these sort of large traditional institutions arrive at a product or an end state. That's really where we've spent a lot of time innovating.
Talk to me a little bit about, this may sound like a naive question, but I don't want to be assumptive. When you say change the way people think and culture, for you and for ARL, what does that really mean?
Again, it's based in the traditional thinking that people have around research. When you bring ARL has got about 2,600 people in it. About 50% of the people, a little more than 50% of our workforce are scientists and engineers. And of those 1,500 or so people, about 55% of them are PhDs.
Wow.
Which makes sense for a corporate research laboratory, right? When you think about the far term and where you want to go long term, it makes sense. What's interesting about that, of course, is that if you have a PhD, you spend a long time. It took me 6 years to finish my PhD in the academic community, and you're trained a certain way, and you're trained to think about the scientific method and how to address open research questions and how to perform research. And many people have said, my advisor included, that that research is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so oftentimes people who are doing research, they have a long view, right? I mean, we're worried about 2035. So if it doesn't happen today, it can happen tomorrow. Whereas the sense of urgency sometimes in research, when you come up in a classical sense. And so when those kinds of attitudes come into these laboratories, and you start talking about innovation, sense of urgency and problem solving to help the warfighter, oftentimes it causes somewhat of a cognitive dissonance, right? We have to train people to think a little bit differently about the space we're in and the problems we're trying to solve and how we're trying to address them. That's kind of what I mean. So you're trying to really remove those cultural biases from, traditional kinds of academic training, if you will, and move people into an environment where they're much more focused on what is the end state, what is the capability, if you will, what is the product, even though it's very early stage research. We want to get people to be soldier inspired or use inspired, to think about what we don't understand, what we're missing from a knowledge base, what's preventing us from delivering on a new technology or a new capability, and then building a research agenda around that, and then having a methodology that allows you to not only solve really deep theoretical questions, but also deliver and translate what you're learning into something that's very useful for the military, either some new level of understanding or some new capability or some new technology.
Well, I really appreciate what you're saying about, let me just back up and say that I've met a lot of the people at ARL, and they're a phenomenal group of people across the research to operations to leadership everywhere. But what I really appreciate about what you're saying is, particularly in innovation, is that need to balance long-term thinking, the exploration, the openness to new possibilities, with that kind of short-term thinking of urgency and outcome and problem solving, and the marrying of those two versus it being a one or the other culture. Because I think oftentimes we get trapped in one or the other.
Yeah, that's right. And for us, these are in tension. No doubt about it. It's tension in the system. And the tension, of course, for leadership, the tension is to ensure that it's a healthy tension.
Yeah.
That we do balance the requirements of what, particularly our senior uniformed leaders, who in the Army in particular, most of the senior leaders, I would say, if not all of them, have spent many years deployed and fighting the last war. So for them, a sense of urgency and an understanding of the war that we're coming out of and an understanding of the threats that this country may face in the future really gives them, a profound sense of urgency.
Yeah.
To want to ensure that the Army is well positioned, not only in the near term, but in the future. And of course, the conversation is, how much of the future do you mortgage with regard to the time and the talent and the treasure, if you will, to take care of present day concerns? That's always what's in tension. And it's a great conversation, but it's a constant dialogue. And, people, I think, from my perspective, one of my jobs is to try to ease the tension and to remove the distractions from the workforce, because all of this discussion about midterm, long-term, future resource investments, different ways to invest, et cetera, causes a distraction. And what we really want is our creative people to be creating and innovating and not worrying necessarily about the drama or the distraction of what the future necessarily might hold from, let's say, a budget point of view.
I want to ask you a question about, a couple of things in there actually that you said, because you said kind of just in passing, but I think they're really important. The first one is you talked about how much do you want to mortgage to the future. Right. Explain that a little bit more and how you think about that, because I do think that's the other side of the tension is, like, what do we need to do today and what's happening today versus trying to have that eye on where you're headed and what's coming next and how to think about those two.
Yeah, well, again, that is really what's in tension, particularly for, a government laboratory that has to answer to many, many stakeholders, not only in uniform, but of course our citizens and our congressional stakeholders as well, and our university partners and our industrial partners. There's so many stakeholders are at the table. The question always is, with limited resources, what are your priorities? And how do you make decisions based on what your priorities are to address, again, it's a continuum of needs and requirements for the near term all the way out to the future. And so where does that distribution lie, and how much money you do invest, and how do you manage your talent, and how do you identify where the gaps are in your talent, and how do you identify what problems you should be working on and who you should be collaborating with?
Right.
Because you can't work on everything. You don't have an infinite supply of resources or talent. So in this environment today, particularly in the 21st century, if we're siloed and we don't force ourselves to collaborate and we don't bring our partners to the table, then you really lose out on so many opportunities for success. But again, it's always this conversation at the leadership level on down about where that balance should be, given the priorities of the day.
And, if I hear you right, it sounds like that priority conversation is ongoing. And I think that's important for us listening to pay attention to, because I think oftentimes prioritization is thought of as a point in time exercise, and then you just stick to it, versus really being a little bit more organic about it and recognizing that you have to keep having that conversation.
Yeah, it is. It's a daily conversation. For the Army, though, I think in its wisdom, really, about a year ago, the Army stood up what's called the Army Futures Command, AFC, which is the biggest reorganization we have gone through as an Army in 40 some odd years. And the reason the Army did it was to put a 4-star general in charge of its modernization, basically from basic science all the way to fielding of new technology, and to be focused on it, and to focus the entire S&T and the acquisition community, if you will, the people who buy things for the Army, and the people who come up with our concepts about the architecture of the Army together under one roof, so that we could really focus and prioritize on a select group of areas that we feel as a nation are critical. So there are 6 of them that the Army's laid out. Just briefly, it's the long-range precision fires. We don't have to deal with. I won't give you details on this. I refer your listeners to the internet if they want to know more. But it's long-range precision fires. It's next-generation combat vehicle. It's the network. It's air and missile defense. It's future vertical lift and soldier lethality. Not in that order necessarily, but those are the 6 things that we are most focused on today. And then the resources, the people, the work is all aligned to help deliver on those things. But they are very, I would say, nearer term objectives. The Army wants to have all of these priorities initially fielded by 2028. So, of course, if you're in the research community and you think about 2028, well, so much of that work is what we did a decade ago. So for us at the research lab, at the corporate lab, it's really necessary for us to not only make sure that if what I refer to as the technical bench of our scientists and engineers, if we can help support the technical bench of the other engineering centers and the other parts of the Army that need our help and our expertise, we lend that near term. But our eye is really focused on the future. So that's what's most important from a research laboratory perspective. And in that space, it's a little gray. The priorities do shift around a bit because, there are some diffuse ideas about what the next capability might be, what the next threat might be, what the next projection or forecast in technology might be. And that's where there's a bit more of a dynamic. But I would say for the first time in many, many years, the Army has got a set of priorities that we are all, pardon the pun, marching to.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I want to, you had mentioned earlier about, we really needed to get out of silos and collaborate more to play in today's world, to innovate. That's kind of one of the challenges you mentioned. What are some of the other challenges that you face at ARL?
Well, there is no greater challenge than finding the best and brightest staff, both research and engineering staff and business staff, to come and work for the United States Army. Particularly in areas of technology where you see, not only emerging trends, but a great amount of emphasis, like, for example, artificial intelligence and machine learning. Trying to hire away some of the university's best and brightest in these areas is a challenge for us because of, we are a government laboratory. Our ability to pay and compete is pretty good, I would say, these days, but not as good in some areas where there's a great pull from the industrial sector. So that's a really big challenge for us. And to show folks coming out of university what the value of service is, what sort of problems they can engage in if they're service-minded to help support not only the country, but to be intellectually stimulated because of the kinds of problems and the nature of problems we're trying to address here. That's really probably our biggest challenge. For example, there's a lot of talk about self-driving cars, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the work that's happening in Google and Uber and other places around the country to try to get self-driving cars on the road. Well, that problem is in and of itself a hard problem, but we know what our roads are. We know we have maps, we have street lights. And so the hardest problem with self-driving cars today, besides the liability, is really trying to find all the other moving things in the scene.
Oh, right.
That's the biggest problem, because everything else you kind of know, right? If you put that into a warfighting parlance, an Army parlance, and you try to have a self-driving vehicle on a battlefield, the problem becomes inordinately more complicated because there are no roads necessarily. There are no street signs.
Right.
There are no maps that may be updated, et cetera, et cetera. So it's that sort of rich nature of the problem that often attracts people to come and work for us. But it is a continual effort and activity on our part to try to bring people here. That's our biggest challenge.
Yeah. How have you overcome that? I think that challenge in particular by leveraging a more innovative approach or business model. And part of the reason I'm asking is I'm hoping you'll talk a little bit about how you collaborate and expanded your pool through really a more innovative model of doing the work that you do versus just, we pay well and, we have great benefits.
Yeah, we recognized about 6 years ago that we had to. You can't be siloed and you can't be local. You have to be as diffuse as you possibly can be organizationally. The Army and all the other laboratories, you think about high walls, you think about guards and fences, and very difficult to get people in, very difficult to collaborate with people. So we realized about 6 years ago we needed to change the model. And so we stood up something we call Open Campus, which provides an opportunity for us to establish these cooperative research and development agreements across a broad array of collaborators, both academic and industrial. And we've reduced part of collaboration, right? I talk about removing the distractions from people. The other barrier to innovation and collaboration is bureaucracy. So
yes,
how do you beat down the bureaucracy? And so our Open Campus initiative was part of that, to really eliminate as much bureaucracy as we could, particularly for our collaborators to come and work with us. And so we solved that problem about 6 years ago, and we've done really well with bringing in new partners for the Army, new ideas, all of the good things that come with that. But we also realized that not only do we want to collaborate, but we want to collaborate in our partners' own spaces. We don't want them necessarily to come to Aberdeen, Maryland, or to Adelphi, Maryland. I want to put our staff into our partners' facilities, and I want to stand up regional laboratories across the country. So we reside in the innovation hubs that we believe the Army needs to be part of and present, ever present in. So what we've done over the last 4 years is we've stood up laboratories across the country. We have a laboratory in California, on the west coast at Playa Vista. We have a laboratory in Texas now that resides at the University of Texas. We have a laboratory in the University of Chicago. We have a laboratory at Northeastern University. And in all of these laboratories now, we have ARL staff who are part of the community. And the way we work in this space is we get our partners to understand the Army's problem space. We get our partners to understand the opportunities for resources and additional collaboration. And then we partner with our academic colleagues in the faculty at many of the local universities. We bring in postdocs who work with this faculty. We bring their students in, either at all levels, either at postgrad, graduate, or even the undergraduate level. And then we begin to partner with the local companies. And that's how we become part of the ecosystem. And ultimately, our goal is to leverage and absorb as much of the culture that are in the national innovation hubs, but also to bring the Army culture to these hubs as well, because so many people have not been exposed to what the U.S. Army is interested in. And oftentimes we have these conversations, people will say, wow, we didn't know you guys were doing that. We didn't know you were interested in that. Let's work together. Sometimes it's relational. Sometimes it's transactional. But we never go into one of these regions. My motto is we have to be friends first. We have to learn how to trust one another. I think trust is built up by proximity, getting to know people and who they are and what their character is. Once we have that, then we talk about money. And so we've had many, many opportunities to fund collaborators in these regions, and it's really working quite well.
So that's my problem.
That's the innovation.
Money is second. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, it's all of our problem.
That's right. That's right. But I want to go back to this for a second, because I think this is, I was kind of quiet because I was kind of deep in thought as you were talking.
Yeah.
I think oftentimes we think of this type of hub collaboration and partnerships as, to your point, everybody comes to me. Like, I pull people in to get the best from people on the outside, but I want to bring it in. And what you're really saying is you're taking kind of more of a two-way approach. People come to you, but you're also going out. And I have to imagine that sending those people out into the communities, whether that's in California or Texas or wherever, really allows for some incredible absorption of experience and thinking that you wouldn't get if everybody were in the same location, dealing with the same things and the same people. So the benefit is them to the communities, but also I would imagine 10 times more back to you as well.
Oh yeah, it's been incredible. I mean, so the thing is, I often say this kind of tongue in cheek, but if you were raised in Southern California and you went to school in Southern California, and you're interested in working for the Army, would you prefer to work in Southern California, or would you want to go to Aberdeen, Maryland?
Right, probably Southern California.
Aberdeen, Maryland is a great place. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful place to raise a family. But if you're coming out of school, you may not necessarily be interested in kind of moving to exburbia, right?
Yeah.
So what's happened is, because when we hire people from the region normally. We've been able to attract people who we probably never would have had an opportunity to do so in the past. And that has really expanded our ability to get exposure to new ideas. It's really been a rich environment for us. We've learned a lot from our collaborators in the regions. And that's the point, because we were very selective where we went and where we established laboratories across the country, so that we could really expand upon our expertise in areas we didn't really have previously. And so we've grown our expertise because we've gotten access to people who you might not necessarily get access to in Aberdeen, Maryland.
Well, what a brilliant way to think about partnership. It's so ironic that we often think of it. We think of partnership as collaboration, but we execute it as a one-way conversation at the end of the day. And what you're doing really is back to what it truly should be. And I just will say very briefly before I kind of go on to, since we're talking about people, I want to go on to culture too, because yours is so strong. Your point about trust, I mean, you are dealing with very critical and sensitive materials, and information. And I have to imagine, or actually you can tell me if I'm wrong, but for the Army to be willing to say, let's go out into the US and into these places and put people in there, really took this level of recognition that, hey, we've got to start trusting and building our resources if we're going to deal with what we need to deal with versus keeping it also, here behind this one campus. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but hopefully you know what I'm trying to get at with trust.
Yeah, no, you are. I mean, there's a lot of sensitivity, particularly if you read the popular press today about the exodus of American intellectual property to competitor nations, right? And the desire, particularly in government, to want to figure out a way to keep that intellectual property on shore. That's a tough question, and I absolutely think that there is truth in what we've observed about what happens in some of these countries. The thing that we have to always be mindful of is where you kind of are in the spectrum of research and development. There are certain things that are mature, that are leaning toward a capability, that we are sort of in the engineering space. We know how to do the engineering, and we're on about doing it. And the secret sauce is perhaps in the manufacturing or in the design and other things. We want to protect that and make sure that those capabilities don't go offshore. There are other things at the other end of the spectrum in foundational research, in basic science, that's where the debate is raging today. Because traditionally we have been very free with our ability to, in the United States, the university system in the United States is world class, right? And I would still say, even though some of our competitor nations are catching up, we still are out in front in most technologies, most research in the world, primarily because of the investment the United States government has made since World War II in basic science. And it's sort of that tension now between, because we live in a near peer and a peer competitive world internationally, that, how much of that intellectual property, even at the basic science level, should we let go internationally? And will that stifle science, and will it stifle the creation of new ideas and discovery? So there's a balance here that we have to strike. And I will tell you that for us, you asked me what one of my bigger challenges is, I want to answer it in this context, is we want to hire U.S. citizens. I'll start with U.S. citizens any day. And so whatever we can do nationally to incentivize the young folks in our country today to have careers in science and technology, engineering, and mathematics, we want to be strong supporters of that, so that our citizens can do this work in a way that benefits the United States first. That's a long problem, I think, to solve, and a difficult one, but it kind of starts with that, right? So one of the things we look for when we go out to our regional partners is, can we help find U.S. citizens who might be interested in serving the nation in a different way? And by that, I mean doing research for the United States Army or any other arm of government, frankly.
I want to dig into the culture at ARL, because we've been talking a lot about people and collaboration. And one of the things I know from working with you and meeting many people on your team is how strong the culture is at ARL. And it's really incredible. You can feel it when you walk in the doors. And you have 5 core attributes. Can you walk us through them? And I kind of want to understand why you picked them. Yeah, I want to know why you picked them, and then really how you make them more than words on a plaque, because I think that's actually where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, it's a challenge, right? So we're trying to change the culture. So I alluded to this earlier on, right? So there is a sense that I often say there is a fallacy associated with time when you're in the research field, where you can be locked into a cycle of publications and conferences, particularly at the basic research level. You come out of an academic environment, you're trained to do two things. You're trained in your research field, of course, but you're also trained to write publications, and you're trained to get money, so to write grants.
Right.
And that's what you're trained in, because that's how you get tenure. What you find today in university, and that's kind of the traditional 20th century, early 20th century model, mid 20th century. What you find today, though, is many of the most compelling academics that I know in the physical sciences in particular are extraordinarily entrepreneurial. And by that I mean they're actively looking for opportunities and opportunities to take advantage of the research they're doing and to find ways to get their research out into a new product or a new idea or even a new paradigm or new way to do science. And it's that entrepreneurial sense, which isn't necessarily about making money, but really taking advantage of opportunity,
right,
where you see it and exploiting those opportunities. The most productive professors that I know have that mindset. And some people think it's a bit, again, there's a bit of a dissonance there because, you're supposed to be this ivory tower professor, and yet you're spinning off companies, and, you've got lots of students that you're trying to get into the most important industries in the nation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's been a big shift across the nation, academically in many, many universities, not all, but in many. So we're trying to bring that here. We want to make sure that our research staff understand the value of being more entrepreneurial, recognizing opportunity. Not only our research staff, but our professional and business staff as well. Where can you take advantage of your talent and your skills to really, progress the mission and the outcomes and the impacts that ARL has for the Army? And that's a cultural thing, again. So that's probably our biggest one,
Yeah.
The second one is impactful teaming. And this goes right back to what we were just talking about with regard to collaboration. The problems today and the questions we're trying to answer today are so complicated and so complex that no single discipline really, if you're going to tackle the biggest problems and answer the most important questions that the Army is interested in, you really can't do it in a single discipline, traditional academic discipline. You have to partner. You have to go across disciplines. You have to become multidisciplinary in your approach to research. And so that's what really impactful teaming is to understand the contributions that many people can have in problem solving, and to bring diversity of thought and diversity of culture and diversity of experience, all of that to the table, but to recognize that you have to become part of a team. It's not about the individual, it's about the team.
Well, it's that goes against the whole lone inventor in the garage. It just doesn't work that way. And I like the way you said that about it's not about one discipline or one perspective. That's a great way to think of it.
Yeah, I mean, again, and you could see the lone inventor for a time, and of course you see instances of that now. But I argue that
Rarely,
it's the nature of the problems we are trying to solve today, and the complexity of the world we live in today that drives us to an interdisciplinary approach. And the folks that are really good at that are the ones that are the most successful.
Yeah, that's a great point. So far, entrepreneurship, impactful teaming, and there's three left, right?
Yeah. The other one is sense of urgency.
Yes.
Again, it's this fallacy of time. We live in an environment where everyone in the organization has to work with a sense of urgency. And again, we're a government laboratory. That's not necessarily built into the culture, right? So how do you get people to work with efficiency for the success of the organization, and to have that sense of urgency because you're mission driven. I often tell the staff here, we know how to work with a sense of urgency. During the height of the war, ARL was involved in putting many technologies into Iraq and Afghanistan to support our soldiers, particularly in the fight against improvised explosive devices. So we know what it feels like organizationally to work with a sense of urgency to get things into the hands of soldiers quickly. But that's not our sort of that's not our quiescent state. You know what I mean? That's not the cultural state we're in. We tend to revert back to the long, because we have the long view, there's time. And so we're trying to change that culture. Mm. The other one is to be service oriented. And this one comes pretty easily, I think, for most of our staff, because we work for the Army. We are all federal servants. But it's a commitment to finding, solving problems and finding solutions and addressing questions that our soldiers need answers to, our Army needs answers to, and to be committed to that. And not only committed to our customer and our stakeholders, to be committed to ourselves as an organization to help serve each other and to look out for one another. That's a very important piece of what we do, or we try to instill in our workforce.
Well, I think the last one. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say the last one is really important for a research laboratory, is to be technically bold, to take risks. Mm. You hear this all over the place about failing fast and failing cheap and learning from your failures, and it's the Silicon Valley model and all of that. And there's truth in that, but that's really a software-oriented approach.
Yes.
It's not necessarily a physical sciences approach. But having said that, so it's a little longer term, but having said that, we do it's funny, scientists and engineers, we're trained to fail fast. Because any design of experiment, when you do experimentation, you fail all the time.
Right, it's part of the process.
That's right. So many things don't work, but the real question is, what do you learn from the failure? Mm. That's what's most important. And what happens, I think, in these communities, particularly in government research laboratories, if you're not careful, when you fail, it's very hard to publish. So if you're going to be measured, and I think that Peter Drucker said, in paraphrasing, what gets measured is what gets done, right? So if you're going to gauge people's success on their publications, and that becomes a major reason for people to succeed, then failure becomes somewhat of a second, third, maybe a fourth order priority, because you need to get your work published.
Right.
So what tends to happen is researchers will take less risk because they'll want to experiment in areas that they know is going to work, or they're going to get some results so that they can publish. So oftentimes the research becomes incremental, right? It's not a real game changer. It's not a big shift, big paradigm shift in the science, or it's not a real disruption in ideas about warfighting capability or whatever. So what we want to do is we want people to become technically bold, to take those risks, and then take what they're learning and put it in a form factor so that what we're learning is consumable by people who can take advantage of it,
right?
Like soldiers, like decision makers, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I love what you just said about the whole fail fast, fail forward. I do a whole thing on that, because I think that sounds great in theory if there's no cost or real failure attached to it. And I love the idea of failure being a part of the process, but I think, to your point, it has to be calculated as well. And I think those 5 too, just to kind of sum it up real quickly: the entrepreneurship, impactful teaming, sense of urgency, service-oriented, technically bold, kind of really wrapped together to create an incredible culture. And I would love to have a whole separate conversation on culture, because I can't even believe we're out of time. So I'm just going to ask you your final piece of advice, kind of what's your one sentence of advice for innovators out there that are working in a big system, kind of like you do at ARL, that are trying to ignite more innovation?
Well, I tell you, there is nothing like building relationships. In this day and age, you have to be relational.
Yeah.
It's important to find transactions. We all need money to keep our businesses open, and our people employed. But it's relationships that matter.
Isn't that the truth? At the end of the day, it's people, which has really been, I think, the theme of all of this. Dr. Perconti, we're going to have you on again because we have more to talk about in culture, and we're out of time. So that was amazing. We'll put a link to kind of the ARO website too, so people kind of see what you're all about. I'm so honored that you shared what you do. As I mentioned in the beginning, I mean, I think the work that you do is critical, but I have a lot of regard for how you do it as well. So thank you.
Well, thanks. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, and I look forward to being on again. We'll see when maybe we can get Kelly Foster to do it next.
Perfect. I'm in.
That'd be awesome.
I know.
Okay.
All right, great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for hanging with us on Inside Launch Street. If you know someone that is truly ready to unlock their innovation advantage, have them join you on Launch Street. Discover your innovation advantage, build a team of high-performing innovators, and ignite ideas and solutions that create massive impact. GOTO, launchstreet.com. Remember, innovators, if you don't take the leap, somebody else will.